September 14, 1945, 40 miles south of Alexandria, Egypt. The heat shimmers off the flat, merciless expanse of the western desert like a physical weight. The air tastes of grit, diesel exhaust, and the harsh chemical sting of cosmoline anti-corrosion grease. Idling at the edge of a massive, freshly excavated trench is a pristine M4A4 Sherman tank. Its olive-drab paint is unmarred by shrapnel, its track pads show zero wear from combat, and the canvas cover over the muzzle of its 75 main gun is still factory-tied. Inside the turret, it smells of fresh rubber and uncured steel. This tank and the 500 others parked in endless, perfectly aligned rows stretching toward the horizon have never fired a shot in anger. And they never will, at least not for the men currently in charge of them. The Second World War is over. In Europe, the guns have been silent for months. In the Pacific, the final surrender has just been signed. But the sprawling, unstoppable logistical apparatus of the Allied war machine possesses a momentum of its own. Ships loaded with materiel had been en route to the Middle East Command, even as the final peace was brokered. Now the British Army in Egypt finds itself drowning in an ocean of unwanted weaponry. Standing on the edge of the pit, Captain Arthur Davies of the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, REME, wipes a mixture of sweat and dust from his eyes. He holds a clipboard heavy with manifests, lists of engine numbers, chassis designations, and shipping codes. These tanks are officially classified as surplus to requirements. To Davies and the exhausted men under his command, they are a colossal 15,000-ton headache. The orders from London were uncompromising, dictated by cold, hard economics and complex geopolitics. Great Britain is virtually bankrupt. The Lend-Lease program, which had kept the empire afloat with American-built equipment, has abruptly ended. Under the terms of the agreement, the British must either pay for the equipment they wish to keep or return it. But the United States Army, already possessing tens of thousands of surplus tanks of its own, has no desire to see these Shermans shipped back across the Atlantic. Furthermore, the British merchant fleet is desperately needed to transport millions of demobilized soldiers back to their homes across the globe. There is no cargo space to spare for dragging 530-ton tanks back to the scrapyards of England, which are already overflowing with the metallic corpses of the European campaign. Selling them on the local market is equally impossible. The Middle East is a volatile tinderbox. British authorities are terrified of heavily arming local factions or nationalist movements in Egypt, Palestine, or beyond. So an impossible situation demands an unthinkable solution. The machines are too expensive to move, too politically dangerous to sell, and too well built to simply abandon to the open elements. They must disappear. Over the roar of the idling Sherman, the deeper, guttural growl of Caterpillar D8 bulldozers echoes across the hardpan. Royal engineers have spent the last 3 weeks carving massive, rectangular scars into the earth, grave fit for mechanical titans. Captain Davies signals with a drop of his hand. The driver of the Lade Sherman, a tired corporal from Yorkshire who has spent the last 3 years keeping battered armor running across North Africa, engages the clutch. The tank lurches forward, tracks biting into the loose sand. Slowly, agonizingly, he guides the machine down the engineered earthen ramp into the bottom of the trench. It groans as it settles into the dirt. There is no ceremony. The driver kills the engine. The sudden silence is jarring. He climbs out of the commander's hatch, taking care not to scrape the thick layer of sticky, amber-colored cosmoline grease that coats the exterior. The REME engineers had debated draining the oil and fuel, but the sheer volume of tanks made the process impossibly slow. Instead, they compromised. Hatches are dogged down tight. Turret rings are sealed with heavy tape. The muzzles are capped. The thick coating of factory grease, designed to protect the steel during the salty Atlantic crossing, is left completely intact. It is a hasty, desperate preservation measure that will have monumental consequences decades later. Once a trench is filled with a dozen tanks, parked nose to tail like a subterranean armored column, the bulldozers return. The blades bite into the massive mounds of displaced sand, pushing it back over the tops of the turrets. The sand flows over the periscopes, buries the machine guns, and finally covers the cupolas. Within hours, the desert reclaims the space. The harsh winds of the Sahara immediately begin to smooth the terrain, erasing the tracks of the heavy machinery. By the end of October 1945, 500 brand-new Sherman tanks have been swallowed by the earth. Millions of pounds sterling, thousands of hours of American manufacturing labor, and enough firepower to equip an entire armored division, simply erased from the visible world. The British forces document the coordinates, file the classified reports deep within the archives in Whitehall, and begin their gradual drawdown from the region. They believe they have solved the problem. They believe the sand will keep their secret forever. They are completely, disastrously wrong. For years, the desert keeps its silence. Above the entombed Shermans, the world rapidly fractures and reshapes itself. The uneasy post-war peace shatters in 1948 with the outbreak of the First Arab-Israeli War. The Egyptian army, marching into the conflict, is a patchwork force equipped with obsolete, hand-me-down weapons and battered armor. They fight bitterly, but the lack of modern, reliable tanks is a glaring vulnerability that costs them dearly. Barely 40 miles away, buried in the dark, dry earth, sits the exact firepower that could have changed the course of their campaign, completely oblivious to the bloodshed. By 1952, the political landscape of Egypt violently overturns. The Free Officers movement, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrows the British-backed King Farouk. The new republic is fiercely nationalistic and desperate to modernize its military to assert dominance in the region and prepare for inevitable future conflicts. But the Western powers, wary of Nasser's ambitions, impose strict arms embargoes. Egypt is starving for steel. It is during this desperate scramble for armaments in the mid-1950s that the whispers begin. They start not in the halls of intelligence agencies, but around the campfires of Bedouin tribesmen who navigate the featureless expanses south of Alexandria. After a particularly brutal campaign, the violent, suffocating sandstorms that arrive in the spring, the landscape shifts. Entire dunes are erased and new ones are born. A group of nomads, scouring the deep desert for leftover brass shell casings and scrap metal from the El Alamein campaign, notice something unnatural protruding from a newly flattened plain. It is the tip of a radio antenna, rigid and perfectly straight, tethered to a heavily greased metal cupola. They pry a single, pristine periscope prism from the strange metallic outcrop and carry it to the markets in Cairo. The prism eventually finds its way onto the desk of Major Tariq Fawzi, an officer in Egyptian military intelligence. Fawzi is a pragmatist, a man who spends his days trying to circumvent Western blockades to secure spare parts for Egypt's failing armored corps. He turns the heavy block of optical glass over in his hands. It is American-made, stamped with a 1944 production date, yet it lacks the microscopic pitting and scratching characteristic of desert combat salvage. It is brand new. Fawzi dives into whatever fragments of British logistical records were left behind after the withdrawal from the Canal Zone. The official manifests show thousands of tons of equipment shipped out or scrapped, but there are curious gaps. Transport ships that arrived in Alexandria heavily laden but departed riding high in the water, with no corresponding inventory of the unloaded cargo ever reaching active depots. The math does not align. In the autumn of 1955, under the guise of a routine geological survey, Fawzi leads a covert, heavily armed detachment into the western desert. They navigate by the vague landmarks described by the Bedouin, driving their jeeps across the blistering hardpan. They carry surplus Polish mine detectors, sweeping the heavy discs back and forth over the sand. For 2 days, there is nothing but the static of the earphones and the blinding glare of the sun. On the afternoon of the third day, the operator's needle violently pegs to the maximum. The audio feedback is not the sharp, isolated shriek of a buried landmine or a lost artillery shell. It is a deep, sustained roar of magnetic interference that stretches on for hundreds of yards. The anomaly is massive. Fawzi orders the men to dig. The sand is densely packed, baked hard by a decade of pressure and heat. The soldiers swing pickaxes and drive spades into the earth, their uniforms soaked with sweat. 4 feet down, a shovel connects with a dull, heavy clank that sends a vibration up the wooden handle. Men drop to their knees, using their bare hands to clear the remaining dirt. What emerges from the sand is not the rusted, burned-out hull of a battlefield casualty. It is an olive-drab steel plate, coated in a thick, amber-colored shell of hardened cosmoline grease. The dry, oxygen-poor environment of the deep desert sand has acted as a perfect time capsule. Fawzi slides down into the pit. He takes a heavy steel crowbar and jams it under the edge of the commander's hatch. It takes the combined weight of 3 men to break the seal, the heavy tape giving way with a loud tear. The hatch swings open with a protesting groan of unused hinges. A rush of stale, hot air hits them, the trapped breath of 1945. Fawzi clicks on a heavy brass flashlight and points the beam down into the darkness. The interior is immaculate. The white paint of the fighting compartment is unblemished. The leather crash pads on the gunner's sight are supple. The dials on the instrument panel are crisp and clear. It is a fully operational M4A4 Sherman tank, requiring only fuel, batteries, and ammunition to spring back to lethal life. Fawzi climbs slowly back out of the turret and stands on the armored roof. He looks out across the vast, seemingly empty desert plain, realizing with a cold thrill that the magnetic anomaly they detected stretches to the horizon. They haven't just found a tank, they have found a phantom army. The encrypted cables sent from the deep desert to Cairo trigger a shockwave through the Egyptian High Command. When the full scale of the discovery is briefed to President Gamal Abdel Nasser, he reportedly listens in stunned silence before recognizing the profound, almost poetic irony of the situation. The British Empire, in its arrogance and haste, had essentially buried the foundation of a modern armored corps right in Egypt's backyard. It is an incalculable gift, but only if it can be exploited in absolute secrecy. If British or French intelligence agencies catch wind that Egypt is suddenly unearthing hundreds of functional medium tanks, they will undoubtedly intervene, citing treaty violations or demanding the immediate return of the stolen property. Nasser authorizes an immediate Black Book operation. A vast tract of the Western Desert is officially designated as a closed artillery proving ground. Armed checkpoints are established miles from the excavation site, with orders to turn back or arrest anyone who approaches, including foreign diplomats and wandering Bedouin. By December 1955, the silent desert transforms into a frantic, clandestine industrial zone. Because they cannot risk using civilian contractors or imported heavy machinery that might draw the attention of high-altitude Royal Air Force reconnaissance flights operating out of Cyprus, the Egyptian military relies on brute force and sheer numbers. Thousands of soldiers are trucked in under the cover of darkness. Floodlights powered by sputtering diesel generators cast long, skeletal shadows across the dunes as the men dig. Extracting a 30-ton piece of dead weight from a deep trench is a logistical nightmare. The Egyptian engineers use surplus American M31 recovery vehicles, anchoring them in the loose sand and spooling out heavy steel winch cables. The cables are shackled to the Sherman's towing hooks. Engines scream, tracks spin, and thick steel hawsers pull taut, humming with terrifying tension. Slowly, millimeter by millimeter, the first Sherman is dragged from its grave, cresting the lip of the trench like a prehistoric beast rising from the tar pits. But pulling them out of the sand is only the first hurdle. The very thing that saved the tanks, the thick, hardened shell of cosmoline grease, is now their greatest enemy. The amber sludge has polymerized over the decade, baking into a consistency resembling hardened epoxy. 30 miles from the extraction site, massive canvas pavilions are erected to serve as covert field workshops. Here, the real agonizing labor begins. Hundreds of mechanics, stripped to the waist in the sweltering tents, attack the tanks with wire brushes, high-pressure steam hoses, and buckets of raw diesel fuel. The chemical fumes are nauseating, burning the eyes and lungs of the crews. They scrape the armor plates, the intricate suspension bogies, and the delicate optics. They meticulously clear the grease from the breeches of the 75mm guns and the internal gears of the turret rings. Then comes the heart of the machine. The British had primarily buried M4A4 variants, powered by the infamous Chrysler A57 multibank engine. It is an engineering marvel and a mechanic's nightmare. 5 separate 6-cylinder automobile engines bolted together around a central drive shaft, comprising 30 cylinders, 5 carburetors, and a terrifying tangle of spark plug wires. If neglected, they are impossible to keep running. But deep in the engine bays, protected from the corrosive salt air of the Mediterranean, the engines are immaculate. Major Fawzi watches nervously as a lead mechanic lowers a pair of freshly charged heavy-duty batteries into the hull of the first fully cleaned tank. They have spent hours priming the fuel lines with fresh, high-octane gasoline. A mechanic climbs into the driver's seat, sets the throttle, and hits the heavy starter switch. For a terrifying moment, there is only the whining grind of the starter motor. Then one bank of cylinders catches, then another. A massive backfire echoes through the canvas tent, followed immediately by a deafening, deep-throated roar. A thick cloud of blue smoke violently ejects from the rear exhausts, filling the pavilion. The ground vibrates, the tank is alive. Over the next 6 months, this miracle is repeated hundreds of times. The sheer scale of the operation is staggering, an entire ghost division resurrected in the dark. But a tank without ammunition is merely a moving bunker. To avoid Western suspicion, Egyptian intelligence agents secretly traveled to Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, securing backdoor deals for millions of rounds of 75mm armor-piercing and high-explosive shells, funneling them into Alexandria hidden in the holds of civilian grain freighters. By the summer of 1956, the political temperature in the Middle East reaches a boiling point. NASA announces the nationalization of the Suez Canal, infuriating London and Paris. The drumbeats of war begin to echo across the Mediterranean. Deep in the Sinai Peninsula, miles away from prying eyes, line after line of M4A4 Shermans sit idling, freshly painted in Egyptian sand yellow camouflage, the Republican eagle stenciled proudly on their turrets. The British are planning an invasion, completely unaware that the very weapons they discarded into the earth are waiting to greet them. November 1st, 1956, the outskirts of Ismailia near the Suez Canal. The dawn sky over the Sinai is violently torn apart by the scream of jet engines. British Canberra bombers and French corsairs sweep low over the desert, unleashing torrents of high explosives and rockets upon Egyptian airfields and infrastructure. Operation Musketeer, the Anglo-French invasion designed to seize back control of the Suez Canal, has begun in earnest, coinciding with a massive Israeli armored thrust across the Sinai Peninsula. Down in the dust and the chaos, British paratroopers and advancing armored columns braced themselves. Intelligence briefings have warned them to expect a mishmash of Soviet-supplied T-34s and Czech Su-100 tank destroyers. But as the haze of the morning artillery barrage clears, Lieutenant James Miller, commanding a troop of British Centurion tanks, presses his eyes hard against his periscope. His column is advancing cautiously toward a vital crossroads when the silhouettes of enemy armor materialize through the shifting dust. Miller's blood runs cold. He knows tank silhouettes like the back of his hand. The approaching machines do not have the sleek, sloped armor and low-profile cast turrets of Soviet design. They are impossibly tall, boxy, and riding on distinctive vertical volute spring suspensions. As the lead enemy tank pivots its turret, the rising sun catches the long, unmistakable barrel of a 75 mm 3 gun. Target front, Sherman's. Miller yells into his radio, his voice cracking with disbelief. I repeat, enemy armor is Sherman M4s. There is a moment of stunned silence on the battalion net. It makes no tactical sense. Egypt's known inventory of functional Shermans was minuscule, practically negligible. Yet cresting the dunes ahead of Miller's Centurions is a coordinated, aggressive formation of dozens of perfectly functioning M4A4s. The engines roar with a distinctive, multi-layered harmonic whine, the terrifying sound of the Chrysler A57 multibank engines running at full throttle. The engagement is brutal and immediate. The resurrected Shermans open fire. High-explosive shells, smuggled in the dark from behind the Iron Curtain, slam into the earth around the British positions. The Egyptian crews, though lacking the extensive combat experience of their adversaries, fight with desperate ferocity. They are defending their homeland in machines that feel miraculously sent from the heavens. The Shermans maneuver through the soft sand with ease, their brand-new tracks biting into the terrain exactly as they were designed to do 11 years prior. While the heavier, modern British Centurions eventually overpower the older Shermans in direct firefights, the sheer shock of their presence disrupts the Anglo-French timetable. But the real earthquake happens not on the battlefield, but 2 days later, behind the lines. A British infantry company manages to disable and capture one of the Egyptian Shermans after its track is blown off by a landmine. The crew has bilayed out, leaving the machine intact. A Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers technical intelligence officer is dispatched to evaluate the capture. He climbs up the side of the sand-yellow tank, scraping away a layer of fresh paint near the engine deck to find the manufacturer's stamps. Underneath the Egyptian camouflage, he finds a thick, stubborn layer of amber cosmoline grease. And beneath that, stenciled in pristine white paint on olive drab steel, is a British War Department census number. The officer checks his ledger. He checks it again, the color draining from his face. This tank isn't a black market purchase. It isn't a Soviet hand-me-down. It is British property. Specifically, it is one of the 500 surplus tanks officially recorded as destroyed and permanently buried in the Western Desert a decade ago. When the coded flash message reaches Whitehall in London, it triggers a crisis of apocalyptic proportions within the Ministry of Defence. It is a logistical embarrassment without equal. The British government has spent millions mounting a massive invasion force, only to discover that their soldiers are being fired upon by their own brand-new, perfectly preserved tanks. The bureaucratic decision to bury the machines rather than scrap them has acted as a multi-million-pound time capsule, creating a covert armory for the very enemy they are now fighting. Worse still, British intelligence completely missed the massive, months-long industrial excavation operation happening right under the noses of their reconnaissance flights. The Suez Crisis ends in a humiliating political defeat for the British and French. Under immense pressure from both the United States and the Soviet Union, the invasion forces are forced to declare a ceasefire and withdraw. Gamal Abdel Nasser emerges as a hero of the Arab world, retaining control of the canal. And the iron ghosts of the desert, they survive their first taste of combat. Though a handful are lost to British fire and Israeli anti-tank guns, the vast majority of the resurrected Shermans retreat safely into the Egyptian interior. They have proven their worth. The Egyptian army mechanics, now intimately familiar with the quirks of the Chrysler engines and the heavy armor, integrate the surviving MAS into their permanent order of battle. The British withdraw, leaving their former weapons permanently in the hands of the Republic. But the story of the buried Shermans is far from over. The desert is unforgiving, and the Middle East is merely pausing to reload. The tanks are about to be thrust into a new era of armored warfare, facing an adversary that will push the 1940s technology to its absolute breaking point. By the early 1960s, the brutal pace of the Cold War arms race renders the battlefields of the Middle East unrecognizable. The Soviet Union begins pouring hundreds of sleek, low-profile T-54 and T-55 medium tanks into Egyptian ports. Next to these modern, thickly armored machines with their devastating 100 main guns, the resurrected World War II-era Shermans look like relics from a bygone age. Their tall silhouettes are bullet magnets, and their original 75 mm3 guns are essentially useless against the frontal armor of newer Israeli tanks. Yet the Egyptian Ordnance Corps refuses to scrap them. The hulls of the buried Shermans, perfectly preserved by their decade in the deep sand, are still structurally immaculate. So in a bizarre twist of geopolitical irony, Egypt turns to the very nation they had just fought at Suez, France. Through covert defense contracts, Egyptian engineers begin a radical modernization program at the massive Helwan tank plant south of Cairo. The Helwan factory floors glow with the harsh, blue-white light of arc welders. The heavy, rounded cast steel turrets of the 1940s are violently unbolted and craned off the M4A4 hulls. In their place, mechanics install the FL-10 oscillating turret from the French AMX-13 light tank. It is an alien-looking piece of machinery, a turret built in two hinged halves, equipped with a high-velocity 75 mm gun and an intricate, clockwork mechanical autoloader capable of firing 12 rounds a minute. To make the French turret fit the wider American turret ring, a custom armored collar is welded to the hull. The resulting machine is a mechanical Frankenstein's monster, an American chassis preserved by British grease, unearthed by Egyptian intelligence, and topped with French autoloading firepower. They are designated the M4FL-10, and they are aggressively deployed to the front lines. June 5, 1967, the Sinai Peninsula. The morning sky is violently erased by the contrails of Israeli Dassault Mirage III fighter jets. Operation Focus, the preemptive Israeli airstrike, wipes out the Egyptian Air Force on the ground in a matter of hours. Stripped of their air cover, the Egyptian armored divisions in the Sinai are left exposed to a merciless, soaring sun and a highly motivated, rapidly advancing enemy. At the fortified crossroads of Abu Ejila, deep in the central Sinai, Captain Youssef Halim sits in the commander's seat of his M4FL-10. The heat inside the oscillating turret is suffocating, baking the smell of hydraulic fluid and heavy French grease into his uniform. The radio nets are a cacophony of panicked voices, static and frantic orders. The ground beneath the tracks begins to vibrate, a rhythmic mechanical tremor that signals the approach of a massive armored column. Halim presses his face against the rubber eye-cup of his periscope. Through the shimmering heat waves distorting the desert floor, the silhouettes of the advancing Israeli armor materialize. For a second, Halim thinks his optics are playing tricks on him. The enemy tanks cresting the dunes possess the same tall, boxy hulls, the same vertical volute spring, suspensions, and the same distinctive engine decks as his own machine. The Israeli Defense Forces, also desperately scavenging for armor in the post-war years, have built their own Frankenstein Shermans. But the Israeli M50 and M51 Ishermans are armed with massive, long-barreled French 105 mm guns, their muzzles tipped with massive muzzle brakes that look like angry, flattened snake heads. It is a surreal, anachronistic nightmare. 22 years after the end of the Second World War, in the blistering heart of the Egyptian desert, two armies of heavily mutated American Shermans are about to tear each other apart. Armor-piercing, range 1200, Halim screams dropping down from the cupola. Inside the claustrophobic turret, the French autoloader violently cycles, slamming a 75mm shell into the breech with a mechanical shriek. The gunner stomps the firing pedal. The FL-10 turret rocks back violently on its trunnions, the blast kicking up a blinding cloud of fine, powdered sand. Halim watches the tracer streak across the desert, sparking harmlessly off the thick frontal glasses of an advancing Israeli M51. The return fire is apocalyptic. The Israeli 105mm guns bark in unison. The air is physically compressed by the shockwaves of the hypervelocity rounds. A tank mere yards to Halim's left takes a direct hit to the hull ammunition rack. The M4 FL-10 detonates with a catastrophic, earth-shattering roar, its 2-ton French turret blown 50 feet into the air on a geyser of orange flame and vaporized diesel. The engagement at Abu Ejila turns into a massacre. Outgunned and lacking air support, the Egyptian armored corps is systematically dismantled over the next 3 days. Halim's tank takes a grazing hit to the suspension, blowing off the drive sprocket and snapping the track. Forced to abandon the immobilized vehicle under heavy strafing fire from Israeli jets, he and his crew flee into the dunes on foot. When the 6-day war ends in a crushing Egyptian defeat, the Sinai is littered with the scorched, shattered carcasses of hundreds of tanks. Among them are the remnants of the Phantom Division. The desert has finally taken back its iron ghosts. They sit immobilized in the shifting sands, their guns silent, their armor pierced, bleeding black oil back into the earth that had kept them safe for so long. In the months and years following the devastating conclusion of the 6-day war, a profound, eerie silence settles back over the Sinai Peninsula. The howling of high-velocity tank rounds and the scream of jet engines are replaced once again by the eternal, relentless whisper of the desert wind. But the landscape has been permanently altered. The rolling dunes are now scarred by the husks of mechanized warfare, a vast, open-air graveyard of twisted metal stretching for hundreds of miles. Among these rusted monuments sit the shattered remains of the Egyptian M4 FL-10s. The Bedouin tribesmen, the very same nomadic people whose sharp eyes first spotted the buried radio antennas a decade earlier, return to the deep desert. Only this time they are not uncovering pristine, grease-covered miracles. They are scavengers picking through the charred ribs of a defeated army, stripping copper wire from destroyed French autoloaders and salvaging road wheels from burned-out American suspensions. If one were to walk up to the pulverized hull of Captain Halim's abandoned tank and scrape away the layers of soot and scorched metal, they would find a geological core sample of 20th century geopolitics. On the surface, the blistered remnants of Egyptian sand-yellow camouflage. Beneath that, the heavy, alien welds of French engineering. Deeper still, microscopic traces of the stubborn, amber-colored British cosmoline grease. And finally, at the very bottom, baked into the raw steel, the original olive drab paint and factory stamps of the Chrysler Arsenal in Detroit, Michigan. It is a machine that traveled across an ocean to fight a fascist empire, only to be deemed too expensive to ship, too dangerous to sell, and too inconvenient to dismantle. Thousands of miles away, deep within the climate-controlled subterranean archives of the Ministry of Defense in Whitehall, London, the original 1945 disposal report signed by exhausted officers like Captain Arthur Davies gather dust. The men who ordered the burial of the 500 Shermans have long since retired to quiet lives in the English countryside. In 1945, they believed they were making a pragmatic, ruthlessly efficient bureaucratic decision. They believed they were solving an impossible logistical equation by simply burying it beneath 1 million tons of sand. They could never have imagined the sheer absurdity of the chain reaction they had initiated. They had unwittingly funded and supplied the armored spearhead of their enemy during the Suez Crisis.